In an age when preaching could cost a man his freedom, when loyalty to conscience was branded rebellion, one humble pastor dared to reform not just his church, but the very soul of a nation. His sermons turned sinners into saints, his writings shaped generations, and his courage lit the path for centuries of Protestant faith. His was a voice that thundered truth and whispered grace, reaching kings and commoners alike. This is the story of Richard Baxter, a man who lived as though every sermon were his last and every soul his sacred charge. Richard Baxter was born in the autumn of 1615 in Rowton, Shropshire, England, into a modest family marked by hardship and spiritual searching. His early years were shadowed by his parents' troubled marriage and financial difficulty. Despite limited schooling, Baxter's mind was keen and hungry for knowledge. Under John Owen at Wroxeter Grammar School, his intellect was awakened. Through reading Puritan authors like Richard Sibbes and Edmund Bunny, his heart was stirred. These works planted the seeds of conviction that would shape his conversion. Baxter later wrote that his awakening came through wrestling with sin and doubt, an experience he called the most blessed work of his life. Those early spiritual struggles forged a humility that would later mark every sermon he preached and every soul he sought to win. At 23, Baxter was ordained by the Bishop of Worcester in 1638, beginning a ministry marked by zeal and controversy. He served first as a schoolmaster in Dudley, then as a curate in Bridgnorth. But it was his appointment in 1641 as curate of Kidderminster, Worcestershire, that defined his legacy. Kidderminster was then a decaying town of about 2,000 people, known more for drunkenness than devotion. Yet Baxter saw in this neglected parish a field ripe for reformation and revival. With tireless devotion, he began preaching, teaching, and visiting every household. His sermons were powerful and plain-spoken, aimed at the conscience and the heart. He preached, he said, as a dying man to dying men. But Baxter did not stop at the pulpit. He visited families, catechized children, and prayed in homes until the town was transformed. Travelers passing through said they could tell from the singing in the streets that they were among a godly people. The church grew so quickly it had to be enlarged 5 times. His method and compassion were later immortalized in The Reformed Pastor, where he wrote that a true shepherd must know his flock and labor, not in indifference, but in love for their eternal good. The 1640s brought civil war between King Charles I and Parliament. Though not a political radical, Baxter sided with the Puritan cause for reform. He served as chaplain to the Parliamentary Army, ministering to soldiers at Langport, Bridgewater, and other battles. His battlefield experiences deepened his conviction that war could serve God's purpose in purifying the church. Yet he refused to embrace extremism, seeking instead a middle way. He envisioned a reformed national church united by essential faith and tolerant in conscience. His maxim, "In necessary things unity, in doubtful things liberty, in all things charity," summed up his lifelong moderation and grace. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, Baxter found himself torn between conscience and conformity. Invited to help shape English religion at the Savoy Conference of 1661, he proposed a simple biblical liturgy, but his hopes were crushed. The 1662 Act of Uniformity required ministers to conform to Anglican rites or face ejection. Baxter refused and was expelled along with 2,000 others. The cost was immense, loss of income, home, and pulpit, yet he stood firm, declaring conscience could not be forced by law. He even declined an offer to become a bishop, preferring faithfulness over position. The following years brought persecution and suffering. Forbidden to preach publicly, Baxter continued privately and through his pen. Despite imprisonment and frailty, he poured out his convictions in writing, producing more than 120 books of theology, devotion, and pastoral care. Among his greatest works was The Saints' Everlasting Rest, 1650, written during illness when he expected death. It urged believers to fix their hearts on heaven, the true rest of the soul, and became a Puritan classic. Another, A Call to the Unconverted, pleaded passionately for repentance before death. His works were not academic treatises, but living appeals to the conscience, written with the urgency of eternity pressing on every page. Baxter's theology resisted labels. Rooted in Reformed thought yet wary of extremes, He emphasized a practical faith joining trust and obedience. While salvation was by grace, he taught that true faith must express itself in love and holiness. His faith law theology, where faith fulfills the law through love, stirred debate but inspired later evangelicals who admired his balance of conviction and compassion. In 1662, Baxter married Margaret Charlton, a devout young woman converted under his ministry. Their marriage was tender and steadfast amid suffering. Margaret supported him through imprisonment and illness, and her death years later left him heartbroken. He called her a mercy of mercies and turned his grief into deeper devotion and service. Though persecuted, Baxter never ceased writing. His books reached homes across England, Scotland, and the American colonies, shaping early evangelical piety. The saints' everlasting rest comforted prisoners, soldiers, and pastors alike. His autobiography, Reliquiae Baxterianae, completed late in life, reveals a man of conscience who wrestled with melancholy and illness, yet saw every trial as divine providence and preparation for glory. Baxter's pastoral insight was ahead of his time. He understood the link between spiritual and emotional health and counseled the anxious with rare empathy. He wrote openly of his own inner struggles, modeling humility for later pastors. He urged believers to obey not from fear but from love, to see holiness as gratitude for grace and a joyful response to divine mercy. His influence reached far beyond theology. Baxter's defense of liberty of conscience helped prepare the way for later arguments for religious toleration. Though he never saw full unity among Christians, his irenic spirit foreshadowed the evangelical cooperation of later centuries. His ideas shaped men like John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Philip Doddridge. Wesley even abridged the saints' everlasting rest for Methodist readers. Despite chronic illness, lung disease, digestive pain, and constant weakness, Baxter never ceased laboring. Weakness itself, he wrote, is a school of grace, and pain a teacher that whispers eternity. He turned suffering into spiritual strength, continuing to write, counsel, and pray until the end. When Richard Baxter died in December 1691 at 76, London's nonconformist community gathered to honor the man whose conscience had outlasted kings. Ministers of every denomination attended his funeral, a silent tribute to the unity he long sought but never saw. Though his dream of a reconciled national church faded, his vision of heartfelt, disciplined, compassionate faith endured. His books continued to mold Protestant devotion for centuries. Richard Baxter's life was a paradox. Weak yet strong, suffering yet joyful, rejected yet fruitful. From humble beginnings, he became one of the most influential pastors of his age, his pen and pulpit reaching farther than any title could have taken him. His story is not merely the chronicle of a theologian, but the witness of a man wholly given to God, whose conscience would not bend and whose heart would not harden. His legacy reminds us that true ministry is measured not by comfort or approval, but by faithfulness and love. His voice still calls across the centuries, urging believers to live with eternity in view and to serve as dying men to dying men. If his story has stirred you, let it challenge you to walk with integrity, to speak truth in love, and to labor faithfully in whatever field God has placed you. And if you'd like more stories of faith, courage, and revival from Christian history, subscribe and join the journey as we rediscover how God used ordinary people to change the world.